Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, your host here on Last Week in the Church. This is the show where we sort through the flotsam and jetsam, the detritus, if you will, of the last week of headlines on the Vatican and global church beat, and try to extricate those few nuggets worthy of your attention. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with the Pope's favorite American. This past week, Pope Francis named American Cardinal Kevin Farrell the new president of the Supreme Court of the Vatican City-State, cementing his profile as the most important American in this papacy. But where does Farrell rank all time? We'll explore. Secondly, going, Ganswein. The latest rumor this week about the fate of the former priest secretary to Pope Benedict XVI is that Archbishop Georg Ganswein will be returning to his home diocese in Germany without any new Vatican gig. We'll unpack what that might mean. Third, of lawfare and loopholes, Pope Francis has condemned the weaponization of criminal justice for political ends, but does he practice what he preaches? We'll try to dig down on that one. Fourth, pressuring the Pope. The anniversary, the 40th anniversary, actually, of the disappearance of the famed Vatican Girl is nearing later this month in June. The brother of Emanuela Orlandi has announced in advance that he expects, indeed demands, that Pope Francis will address the case during his Angelus address on June 25th. We'll try to look down the line at what that might mean. And then finally this week, not naked lunch, naked lurch. A guy goes into St. Peter's Basilica, strips naked, and jumps up onto the main altar of the Basilica to protest the war in Ukraine. The Vatican later stages a rite of reparation. There's really nothing more to say about that, but we're going to say it anyway. So all that and more is waiting for you this week on Last Week in the Church, so please stay where you are. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy June 6th to you. Happy Tuesday. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. Here in Italy, it was a holiday weekend, which my wife Elise and I always love because the city of Rome empties out, and for once, it doesn't feel like a baton death march to get from one part of the city to another, so we actually had quite a lovely time. We begin this week with the latest kind of personnel move by Pope Francis. He appointed 4 cardinals to positions on the Supreme Court, the Corte di Cassazione, basically the ultimate court of the Vatican City-State, and as president of the Corte di Cassazione, he nominated Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Dublin-born but naturalized American citizen, who is the prefect of the Dicastery for Family, Laity, and Life. He's also been named by Pope Francis as the Camerlengo, that is the official who acts as the sovereign of the Vatican after the death or resignation of a pope and before the election of his successor. He is the head of a new commission for reserved materials. It's basically a body that decides which Vatican contracts, for various reasons, have to be kept secret and therefore not part of public transparency systems. He's also the head of the Vatican's investment committee that oversees its fairly ample investment portfolio. So, in other words, this latest gig is another example of how this Pope really, really likes Kevin Farrell. And I think there's very little question that it means that Kevin Farrell is now the most influential American, again, with an asterisk, born in Dublin, I get it, but he was incardinated into the Archdiocese of Washington in 1984. All of his pastoral experience has been in the United States as an auxiliary bishop in Washington and later as the Bishop of Dallas. If you ask him, he will tell you he is an American. So for all intents and purposes, this is an American. And of course, the irony is that Pope Francis has a reputation for having a little bit of a chip on his shoulder when it comes to Americans, right? For having the same ambivalence, the kind of love-hate relationship with the United States that many Latin American leaders do. And yet, with this particular American, Francis has invested a great deal of trust and confidence. Now, the question, I don't know if this question is like obligatory, but if you are an egg-headed church affairs junkie type, like myself, the question that occurs is, where does this put Farrell all time in terms of the most influential Americans in the Vatican under a particular pope. Now, I have a piece that is going to be coming out on the Crux website tomorrow. So I don't want to steal too much of my own thunder, but let me just give you 2 small spoilers, okay? And the rest of it you're going to have to read for yourself. Number 1, Farrell is not number 1. He actually comes in at number 4 on my all-time list, which means there are 3 figures ahead of him. Hint, 2 of those figures date to the papacy of John Paul II, 1 to the papacy of Benedict XVI. And if you like, you can spend the next 24 hours scratching your head over who those folks might be until the list actually rolls out. Other spoiler alert, not everybody on this list is a cleric. It would be easy to assume that in order to be the most powerful figure from a nation in the Vatican, you have to wear a red hat, right? You've got to be a prince of the church. Well, not so. Sometimes, actually, cardinals in the Vatican don't wield nearly as much influence as people who are at lower levels, either clerical or lay, but who actually have their hands around the real levers of power. And I hope this list brings that point home as well. More than that, I dare not say, because if I did, why in the world would you go on the site tomorrow and read it? So please do. And I invite people, by the way, who read this list, because it's a terribly subjective enterprise, right? Like trying to decide who the most powerful American in the Vatican is. It's not like that is an objective metric, okay? So I invite people who are going to read this to write me with their reactions, tell me what I got wrong, and hopefully we can have an ongoing conversation about it, because, you know, I don't know how important this question is, but I can tell you it is enormous fun. So get in on it. All right. Second up this week, we have Going Ganswein. So Archbishop Georg Ganswein was, of course, the priest secretary to the late Pope Benedict XVI, both while Benedict XVI was in office and then for that decade that he spent in retirement as the emeritus pontiff in the Mater Ecclesiae monastery on Vatican grounds. Now, after Benedict's death, of course, and we've talked about it ad nauseum on this show, Ganswein, well, earned a reputation as a kind of face and voice of the pro-Benedict, and therefore, at least to some extent, anti-Francis, more conservative wing of the Catholic Church. This because of a book, a set of memoirs that Ganswein issued called Nient'altro che la verità, Nothing But the Truth, in which he cataloged some differences between Francis and Benedict, also because of a couple of media interviews Ganswein gave around that time, in which, among other things, he talked about how Pope Francis's decision to roll back the liberalization of the old Latin Mass that Benedict had granted broke the late Pope's heart. And all of that has created a situation in which Ganswein has become perceived as a kind of in-house symbol of the quote-unquote loyal opposition to Pope Francis, which in turn has generated a lot of speculation about what his future might be. And you know, we've followed the bouncing ball here on this show. One stage, it was reported that he was set to be sent as the new papal nuncio, that is, the ambassador to Costa Rica. Then it was reported that Francis had given Ganswein a choice of whether to stay in Rome or go back to Germany, but in any event, he had to get out of the Mater Ecclesiae monastery. Latest development is that Ganswein had an audience with the Pope this past week, after which a German news outlet reported that Ganswein has been told that he has to go back to his home diocese in Germany, that's the Diocese of Freiburg, and that he's not going to have any new Vatican gig there. So he's not going to go back as the bishop or some papal delegate or envoy. He'll simply go back as a private citizen. He would be expected, if that pans out, he would be expected to teach and also to continue to sit on the Ratzinger Foundation, which is devoted to the memory and particularly the theological works of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. Now, if this comes to pass, and let me emphasize again, this is merely the latest rumor we have heard. But if it comes to pass, let me predict for you how this is going to be seen. Fans of Francis will say, well, look, Every other prior priest secretary to a pope had to leave Rome. So why shouldn't Ganswein? I mean, there's nothing to see here, is what they will say. And that's true as far as it goes. On the other hand, critics of Francis will say, well, yeah, but those other private priest secretaries got other gigs, right? Like Monsignor Capovilla, who was the priest secretary to John the 23rd, was named the prefect of the Holy House in Loreto. Or, obviously, the most famous case here would be Stanislaw Dziwisz, Archbishop Dziwisz, the priest secretary to John Paul II, who was named the cardinal, the Archbishop Cardinal of Krakow under Pope Benedict XVI. So, yeah, sending Ganswein packing would, in a sense, be just par for the course, but sending him without any kind of new assignment would certainly, by critics of Francis, and I think even by some fair-minded people, would be read as a kind of, well, the Italians would call it a disprezzo, a kind of act of disrespect, a snub, if you like. In other words, it would be seen as punitive. Now, of course, Francis is Pope. He has full authority to decide to whom he wishes to give jobs and who he doesn't. And so that is entirely his call. But if he wants to avoid exacerbating or aggravating the tensions the perceived tensions anyway, that already exist, he might want to consider some kind of face-saving assignment that could be given to Ganswein that at least would avoid the invitation to people to read this as a kind of papal smackdown. Okay, enough said. Third up this week, of lawfare and loopholes. So, one of the remarkable things about Pope Francis is that despite being 86 years old, and therefore the oldest reigning pontiff in the last 145 years, you have to go back to Leo XIII to find a pontiff who was older than 86 while he still sat on the throne of Peter. Despite all of that, Pope Francis remains a remarkably withered, kind of au courant figure. And one measure of that is that he often drops the latest buzzwords into conversation. Good example of that is that on a couple of different occasions, he has used the term lawfare. Now, lawfare is a neologism, that is a new word, that combines the words law and warfare. And it kind of stands for a weaponization of the criminal justice system in order to punish your political enemies. So that is, whipping up false criminal charges against someone simply because you don't like their politics. And the Pope has cited this, among other things, in the context of Brazil. Both the current president, Lula, and also former president Dilma Rousseff. Lula, of course, spent 19 months behind bars between his two terms. Rousseff was impeached. In both cases, a lot of people feel that the charges made against them were political. And Francis obviously agrees with that. He has said, we must raise our voice against this kind of abuse of the criminal justice system. Now, that's all well and good, but the thing of it is, a pope is especially vulnerable to charges of not necessarily practicing what he preaches on this score, because let us remember, the Pope has his own criminal justice system in the Vatican city-state. We sometimes lazily say that popes lost their temporal power in 1870 when they lost the papal states. False. False. And can we please never say that again, because it isn't true. What the popes lost in 1870 was territory, not power. Within the 108 acres of the Vatican city-state and the Vatican's extraterritorial property, the Pope retains full temporal authority. And in fact, Pope Francis just put out a new fundamental law for the Vatican city-state where this was reasserted in the most sweeping fashion possible, stating that the Supreme Pontiff has full executive, legislative, and judicial authority. Full stop. In other words, there's no separation of powers whatsoever. And when it comes to the judiciary, it also said that the Pope has the right to intervene in a criminal case at any point he wants, either during the investigation or the trial, and to reach a decision or to defer action, and no matter what he does, there can be no appeal. Okay, so the Pope has complete control over the system. Now, where this becomes relevant is that there is, of course, a mega trial, a trial of the century, currently going on in the Vatican involving charges against 10 defendants, including, for the first time, a cardinal, Italian Cardinal Angelo Becciu, for various forms of financial crime. And this week, there was a hearing in that trial in which Becciu's attorneys appealed to the court to admit into evidence a series of WhatsApp messages between one of the witnesses and the chief prosecutor, Italian layman Alessandro Didi, and also to admit into evidence omitted portions of the prosecution's star witness's testimony, that is, Italian Monsignor Alberto Perlasca. Now, the judges rejected both of those requests, siding with Didi that that material is relevant, has to be kept secret because it's relevant to other ongoing open investigations. Now, the thing of it is, if you haven't seen the material, you have no way of knowing, obviously, whether that decision is justified or not. But I ask you, just in the abstract, would you think it is fair that the judges who made that decision are paid, hired, and fired by the same guy who controls the police and the prosecutors? In other words, that one single figure is literally pulling the strings of the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Like, I think ordinary people would just say, well, no, obviously that isn't fair, right? And that's, by the way, that's also standard Catholic social teaching. Look it up. Chapter 8 of the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church says the autonomy of the judiciary is a cornerstone of a well-ordered society. It is striking in that regard that Pope Francis, the great reformer, did not take this opportunity to inject another reform, that is, to make his judiciary independent, so that it would not be open to charges of practicing lawfare, which is precisely, by the way, what Becciu's defenders say is going on here. They say Becciu has been tried and convicted in the media. Meanwhile, this trial has not yet produced a smoking gun that suggests conclusive evidence of a real crime. You know, we'll have to see what verdict they eventually reach, but I will say that it is a situation that Pope Francis might want to look at so that he cannot be accused of wielding lawfare in-house while he denounces it ad extra. All right? Fourth up this week, pressuring the Pope. So we have talked a great deal on this show about the famous Vatican Girl case. This is the 1983 disappearance of a 15-year-old teenage girl whose father was a minor official in the prefecture for the papal household and whose family lived in an apartment on Vatican grounds. Her name is Emanuela Orlandi. And her disappearance has become, well, it is the defining what the Italians call un giallo. Literally, that means a yellow. It means a mystery story. Basically, the Orlandi case is to Italy what the Kennedy assassination is to the United States. It is an absolute magnet for speculation and conspiracy theories and just the kind of most outlandish sort of suggestions you can possibly imagine. So this week, there was another new suggestion. A former member of the Carabinieri, that's the military police here in Italy, has suggested yet another new location in which he is suggesting the remains of Emanuela Orlandi might be buried. There have been at least a half dozen of these suggestions over the years. This guy is proposing another one. I would note, for the record, this guy was a Carabinieri for about 5 minutes decades ago, and in the meantime has gone on to suggest that the Orlandi kidnapping or the Orlandi disappearance is part of an ongoing war over liberation theology in the Catholic Church that is being orchestrated by radical members of the Dominican order. You know, think what you will, but I would suggest maybe that's the most face value plausible testimony or suggestion we've ever heard. Anyway, the other news is this. The 40th anniversary of Emanuela Orlandi's disappearance will fall on June 22nd, which is a Thursday. Her brother, Pietro Orlandi, has organized that he is putting together a sit-in at the Vatican for the following Sunday, June 25th. He's inviting people to join him at Castel San Angelo. The plan is then to process down the Via della Conciliazione, that's the broad street that leads up to the Vatican, and end up in St. Peter's Square to listen to Pope Francis's traditional noontime Angelus address, in which Pietro Orlandi has announced that he expects, indeed he's almost demanded, that Pope Francis will address the 40th anniversary of the disappearance of his sister. Remember, of course, the Vatican recently announced it was opening its own investigation of the Orlandi case, and that it will also cooperate with public investigations. The Rome prosecutor's office, for instance, has announced its own investigation. The Italian parliament is currently debating whether or not to have one of its own. And in any event, Pietro Orlandi has said that he expects that the Pope, and he is bringing people with him who are going to be very disappointed, he has said, if Pope Francis doesn't say something, and say something, obviously, that they would like, about the Vatican's commitment to getting to the bottom of what happened to his sister. Now, here's the thing. On the one hand, it's perfectly reasonable, actually, to think that on the 40th anniversary of a case that has been so traumatic for the nation of Italy and the city of Rome, that the Bishop of Rome and the Primate of Italy might have something to say about it. So it's hardly the wildest thing that anybody has ever put on the table. But on the other hand, here's something that those of us who watch Pope Francis on a regular basis know well. This is not a pope who likes to be told what to do. Okay? He doesn't like to be painted into a corner. He doesn't like people publicly saying, you must do X. And, in fact, what experience would tell us is if you try to do that, if you try to paint him into the corner, that is a really good prescription for him doing precisely the opposite. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on June 25th. If I were a betting man, which I'm not really, it's probably the only major vice I don't possess, but if I were a betting man, what I would bet is that Pope Francis will, in fact, address the Orlandi case, but he's going to say something that will be perceived as slightly critical of the way Pietro Orlandi has gone about trying to bang the drum on this. Remember, not long ago, Pietro Orlandi got into hot water for saying some pretty sleazy things about the late Pope John Paul II, suggesting that, he might have had some kind of role in operating a pedophile ring in the Vatican in which his sister got swept up. Francis, on 2 different occasions, has defended the integrity and moral decency of John Paul II, basically rejecting those charges outright. Would not be a huge surprise to me if Francis were to say something on the 25th about how the search for truth must always bear in mind also the protection of the reputations of the innocent, must, operate in a spirit of Christian charity and not vengeance and gossip. So, we will see. But if I were going to trundle off to a casino someplace and plunk down 5-year on what might happen, that would be my bet. All right, finally this week, we have not Naked Lunch, but The Naked Lurch. Naked Lunch is, of course, the title of a famous novel by William Burroughs, part of the whole Beat Generation frenzy. But this is not referring to a Kerouac-esque journey into, the surreality of the beats, but instead to an incident this past week in which a man who has been described as psychologically disturbed entered St. Peter's Basilica as part of the general public, got near the main altar in the basilica, proceeded to strip naked and leap up onto the altar. Now, he had on his body stenciled the phrase something like, "Save the children of Ukraine." And so it was assumed that this gesture was intended to protest the war, and in particular, as a reference to the Ukrainian children who have been removed by Russian forces from the eastern portion of the country and taken into Russia. Of course, when President Vladimir Zelensky recently visited the Vatican, he asked the Pope's help to get those children back. Maybe you can situate that in this context. But in any event, stripping naked, jumping up onto the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica, whatever your point is, that is not an act that bespeaks sound psychological stability, right? So the guy was quickly, wrestled down by members of the Vatican security forces and taken off for evaluation. Now, this, of course, comes at a time when the security membrane around the Vatican has been under some question not long ago. As you will remember, another guy described as psychologically disturbed tried to get into the Vatican by ramming his car through one of the entrances. He was actually shot at by, well, not him, but the car was shot at by a member of the Vatican gendarmes. They were trying to take out the rear tire, actually hit the bumper. 5 more minutes on the firing range this week for that guy. But in any event, the car got as far as the cortile, the courtyard inside the Vatican, and then that guy too was stopped, arrested, and sent off for evaluation. Several catty things one could say about this. 1, 2 psychologically disturbed guys in a row. You could draw the conclusion that you really got to be nuts to want to get into the Vatican these days. But, setting that aside, the more serious question that's been asked is, how come it is so seemingly easy for people who are suspicious or, maybe don't have all their ducks in a row, to get so close to the Vatican? I mean, how is it possible to jump up onto the altar in St. Peter's Square, for instance? Why aren't there motion sensors, right? And bulletproof plexiglass around it? Why isn't this like a scene from Mission Impossible, where you need Tom Cruise descending, right, with one of those temperature thingies, and some guy, some computer whiz in a van guiding his movements in order to get there? How come you can just jump on it? Well, first of all, this is not a movie, it's real life. Secondly, the Catholic Church is funny this way. Yes, we want to take reasonable security precautions, but at the end of the day, we also pastors do not want to separate themselves from the people they're trying to serve unnecessarily. When you come to St. Peter's Square, you want to be able to feel like you can get close to the altar, which is the center of papal worship, in some ways one of the most sacred liturgical spaces on the planet, if you are a believing Catholic. You don't want to feel separated from that, and you don't want the security apparatus to be so thick that it's security and not spirituality that is on your brain in that moment. Remember, too, that from the point of view of the people who make these decisions, that is, the Cardinal Archpriest of St. Peter's Basilica, all the way on up to the Pope himself, whatever else you may want to say, these are believing Christians, and they believe that ultimately their fate is in the hands of a higher power, right? That ultimately it's not concrete barriers and motion sensors that are going to determine their fate, but it's providence. And, it just is what it is. Frankly, having been in and around the Vatican as long as I have, to me, the surprise is not that this kind of thing happens occasionally, it's that it doesn't happen way more often than it does. Because if you were really determined, you could probably get an RPG into a papal audience with no particular problem whatsoever. I'm not inviting you to do that, by the way, but just saying. And that's a bit of an exaggeration. But nevertheless, the truth of it is, compared to other major global institutions, the security apparatus at the Vatican is remarkably thin, and that is by design. Reflects faith in providence and also faith, ultimately, in humanity. And look, call that naive if you want, but there's something charming and kind of inspiring about it. All right, that is our show for this week. You can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site, that is cruxnow.com. When you go on there, you will find an update on the medical situation of our good friend and Crux's managing editor, Charlie Collins. We've been trying to raise funds for him through a GoFundMe campaign for he, his wife, and their 2 boys. You'll find the latest on his situation. Please check that out, and if you can, donate. We will be back here next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed week. We will talk to you again very soon.